Hey friends, imagine this. A country spent 40 years bragging that it lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, only to have tens of millions of them now sprinting back to the countryside because the cities have run out of jobs. Yeah, China's new return to hometown wave is not a heartwarming story about, rural nostalgia. It is a mass evacuation. It's what happens when a country that claims the future is bright suddenly forgets to pay their electricity bill. And last week, Beijing accidentally told the whole world the truth. A Ministry of Agricultural meeting meant to be boring, bureaucratic, actually revealed something the CCP has tried to hide for years, which is China is witnessing the largest reverse migration since the Cultural Revolution. And this time, people are not returning to the countryside by choice. They're returning because the economic system is collapsing under their feet. Let's break down what Beijing hopes you never hear. So, the Ministry of Agriculture held a meeting in Yunnan. Nothing unusual, right? Except the agenda included two bombshell goals. First, prevent large scale migrant workers returning to the countryside. And second, prevent large scale re-poverty, which means, migrant workers are losing their jobs and returning back home. And we are freaking out. And things are bad when the Chinese government publicly admits the thing it usually arrests people for saying. And the local numbers are just brutal. In Henyang, Henan, 183,000 migrant workers returned home this Lunar New Year, and only 40,000, went back to the city to work. Not because the rest of them didn't want to, but because the coastal jobs vanished, or just wages fell so low that it's no longer worth it to migrate to the city. And it's no longer just factory workers going home. This year, 15 million people are expected to return to the countryside to start businesses. Well, what kind of businesses can they start? Selling sweet potatoes? Most of these people are college grads who can't find jobs, and factory workers eliminated by Beijing's obsession with industrial upgrading. So cities are unaffordable for them, but countryside is it's not much better. Welcome to the Chinese dream in 2025. Once these people go back to countryside, they'll find out that there are no jobs in rural areas. None. And most people have to return to farming. Except, surprise, many don't even know how to farm anymore because they moved to the cities for 10 to 20 years, and during that time they never touched a shovel. And then suddenly they're expected to resurrect the rice harvest. Even if they try, many families don't have farmland anymore. To farm, they must rent land. And then after a full year of back-breaking labor, they earn less than maybe 1/10 of factory wages from their past life. So income collapses to, 1/10 of what they used to make in the city as migrant workers. This is not poverty alleviation. This is poverty restoration. Now, what happens when tens of millions of them cannot farm and don't earn enough to eat? And that's where things get dangerous. And Beijing knows it. We're dealing with a generation that cannot farm, has no farmland, and grew up in cities with zero agricultural skills. What happens when cities no longer offer jobs to these people, but countryside cannot absorb tens of millions of them? Farming just doesn't pay enough to feed a family in China. And people watch their savings and living standards collapse overnight. Well, you will get anger, desperation, and a political powder keg. In Chinese history, the most dangerous population is not the starving poor. It is the formerly stable, formerly hopeful class that suddenly collapses into poverty. And right now, China is creating tens of millions of them. A migrant worker population that can stay in the cities but cannot survive in the countryside either, can't feed their children, and has nothing left to lose. That is the demographic that starts movements, riots, revolts. And the CCP fears this more than anything. Because one hungry man with no future might be manageable, but 20 million hungry people who used to have a future in a city because of the real estate boom, this is how history shifts. Ask the Qing dynasty, ask the French, ask anybody who thought, these peasants would just stay quiet. And CCP knows this, which is why their agriculture ministry literally warned that they should prevent massive, return to hometown and massive re-poverty. Because massive re-poverty means massive instability. And instability is the only thing authoritarian regime cannot tolerate. Now, why are these tens of millions being driven out of cities? We mentioned, they cannot find jobs. People are not going home because they miss the countryside. They're going home because Chinese cities have stopped creating jobs for them. But why? Well, because in the past few years, foreign investors have fled or closed their factories. Private Chinese companies collapsed left and right, and many factories moved overseas. Construction sites froze. Capital was demonized. The state advances, but the private retreats. And the CCP basically told private entrepreneurs like Jack Ma, thank you for building the economy. Now, please disappear. And when you scare away capital, this is what happens. The assembly lines go quiet. The cranes stop moving. And millions of these migrant workers suddenly discover their city doesn't need them anymore, on top of the real estate collapse. And anyone familiar with China's history knows this. China's economic rise began when these farmers were freed from the farmland and allowed to work in the factories in cities. The flow of rural Chinese labor created decades of economic growth, the demographic dividend. And now the CCP is reversing that flow, dragging these people, back into a life that they thought they escaped forever. And Beijing is basically telling these migrant workers, congratulations, Your upgrade from poverty has expired. This is not development. This is a system, eating its own achievements. And, Beijing knows exactly what's happening. That's why their agriculture ministry admitted that return to countryside means return to poverty. And both are accelerating both trends. But do they plan to fix it? Do they have a plan? Of course not. Because in CCP's political calculus, these farmers, migrant workers, have always been low-end population. They don't matter. They're good enough to build the skyscrapers in the cities, but not important enough to protect. And China's reverse migration is not just a symptom of the economic slowdown. It is a clear sign that the model that powered China's rise has fundamentally broken. And China has no idea how to fix it, how to come up with new growth engines to absorb these labor, except pushing them back to the past. Millions returning to the countryside is not a renaissance of rural area. It's a nationwide alarm bell. And this Beijing's bright future narrative, it turns out it was never bright.